Hi there. In this video we'll be talking about two different impulses in American history in the 1830s, 1840s, and 1850s. The impulses to reform American society and the impulse to expand America's reach, specifically across the continent. Now these two topics may at first glance seem unrelated, but they speak to the extent to which changes in American society were causing Americans to reevaluate what was possible or necessary in their country. Now, the dominant impulse among historians over the past few decades is to think about these two desires for reform and for expansion as two different responses to what you've heard of before, the market revolution. In both of them, people, many of whom felt that in some way the market revolution was passing them by or helping other people more than it was helping them, saw in America the chance to carve out new spaces in which they could finally realize the promise of freedom and democracy. Yet the definitions of those freedoms keep historians up at night. They are so various and sometimes so vague as frequently to confound attempts to call them part of the same process. What's more, as we mentioned when we discussed the market revolution, many historians aren't entirely convinced that what was happening here was based on economics. Indeed, some historians have argued that historical actors were motivated by politics or cultural factors rather than economics, and have noted that some people who we think acted as though they ought to be opposed to these economic changes sure did seem to talk about these economic changes as though they were really great. So try to think about what other factors might have influenced people's behaviors in these areas, and to consider whether our explanations really cover what's going on. Now, a decent starting place for thinking about the numerous changes that were taking place in America is the Second Great Awakening. This is sort of going to be our into it, so I'll ask you to think about lots of kinds of reform, but we're going to explore that via looking at the Second Great Awakening. The Second Great Awakening was a religious revival that spread up and down the East Coast from around the beginning of the 19th century, it's fair to say right after the American Revolution, and lasted through the 1840s or so. Now, if you've been paying attention, you will see that those dates, beginning of the 19th century to the 1840s or so, correspond roughly to the market revolution, which was also rushing through America during the first half of the 19th century. Now, that's not a coincidence exactly, but the devil for historians is in figuring out how those events are related. Now, this is one of those places where social historians, which is pretty much what I am, and religious scholars differ. Social history tends to argue that this religious tumult was a byproduct of economic forces, that people were so stressed out by the changes taking place economically that they turned to religion for solace, which then changed how they did politics. So if you look at this picture, for instance, it's possible to read the behavior of these people sitting on the benches and holding up their hands here and collapsing in fits of ecstasy as a way of release from the newly constraining economic situation that they're in. Or, relatedly, you might look at this picture and say, these people have not been able to function within the new market economy. They can't handle the stress of banking and of entrepreneurship the way that other people have, and so they have to look to a higher power, or perhaps a charismatic leader, for help with their problems. So that basically captures the social historian's view of the Second Great Awakening, although in fairness, I want to say social historians are usually trying to look for more complex answers than we could summarize here. Religious scholars, on the other hand, tend to suggest that the lines are blurrier than that. And in fact, they say that people respond to religious impulses in ways that aren't usually easily explained by economics. And they have a point here. The man on stage here is very likely to be looking at texts and ideas that vastly predate any economic changes that were taking place in America. So not just the Bible, but previous and earlier religious traditions, like, say, religious revolts in the 1640s and things. And so noticing that and noticing how those words became compelling to their audiences, historians of religion often try to look beyond basic economics. At the very least, it probably isn't fair to reduce the people in this painting to merely tools in a larger economic history. It's very probable that their beliefs and ideas stemmed from something more personal and cultural than merely feeling economically alienated. Now, if you like, you can place other changes, not just the Second Great Awakening, but other impulses for reform into the same rubric as we place the Second Great Awakening. For instance, you can argue that it was economic changes that spurred the philosophical suggestions made by Henry David Thoreau or Ralph Waldo Emerson. And you can also look at the changes proposed by the feminists of the mid-19th century under this rubric as well. So here's Elizabeth Cady Stanton, just a few years after she and others published the Declaration of Rights and Sentiments, declaring women to be equal. You can look at this as a response to market and economic changes as well. For instance, women's position in the home and the family was changing significantly as the middle class began to grow. Women were starting to be confined in ways that they never had been before to the home. So it's perfectly possible to see this as merely an economic response. On the other hand, it is also possible to see that economics maybe doesn't cover every possible angle here. For instance, Thoreau and Emerson, as well as Elizabeth Cady Stanton, each referred to earlier intellectual traditions. Their minds were deeper than merely reacting to economic change. Yet, of course, they both undeniably emerged during a time of economic growth and change. So what was the connection between the movements for reform, or between the political and economic changes they coincided with? That question of connections between reform and politics and, on the other side, economics, will become more and more important as we approach the Civil War. Did the war result from all this social and political ferment? Did the desire to encourage temperance, to encourage feminism, to remake society in a more moral and just way, did that lead into, for instance, the movement to outlaw slavery? Or did the war stem merely and inevitably from the collision of two different economies, the northern free labor economy and the southern slave economy? Did the upsurge in religious feeling make people more likely to oppose slavery? Or did northern opposition to slavery result more from having moved past slavery economically, as industrialization began to cut the cords between the North and the cotton economy? The Mexican-American War, and indeed the whole movement west, highlights how difficult these questions are to answer. The people advocating war with Mexico in order to get to Texas were hoping to extend America all the way to the Pacific Ocean, and specifically those people wanted to push slavery west. If you look at this cartoon, which is actually about the drive west for Oregon, liberty or death, you will see that absolutely related to the desire to go west was the desire to get an equal stake in Texas. So you can see the president here, James K. Polk, saying, "Go to Texas." And similarly, you can see John Calhoun, the South Carolinian politician who was one of slavery's greatest advocates, pushing west along with other people wanting to go to Oregon. Yet I want you to be sensitive to what people like Calhoun and Polk wanted out of Texas. You will find, in fact, that they used very much the same language of liberty, freedom, and rights as the people who were pushing for moral reform, the people who wanted to reform society in a more moral direction. And as ironic and ridiculous as it may seem to us today, people in the 1840s and 1850s, when they spoke of pushing slavery west, the ones in the North typically spoke about that as a terrible thing that would diminish Americans' liberties. The ones in the South spoke about it and meant it as a way to increase freedom throughout America. Yet, of course, their definition of freedom necessarily excluded whole groups of people, most especially African Americans, not to mention the unmentioned group here, Mexicans. So what exactly were these people playing at?